Spring sunlight spilled over the old Victorian house where a German shepherd once stepped out from the shadows of his past. Once a brave canine, he now wore the gentle role of a therapy dog, bringing peace to hearts that had been broken. Among old photographs, trembling hands reaching out and eyes filled with renewed trust, a story of loyalty and the power to heal quietly unfolded. But then, one unexpected moment made everyone realize this journey carried a meaning far deeper than they had ever imagined. Morning in Fern Hollow began with a light mist that drifted like breath, winding through hedges and settling into the damp green blades of grass at the front of Helen Carter's home. The first touch of sunlight reached the deep red tiles of the old Victorian roof. Just as the scent of black tea drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the warm aroma of fresh toast, bringing the kind of peace Helen had kept as a daily ritual for years. In the tiled kitchen, the oak table sat in its familiar place by the wide window, the very spot where she liked to sit and sip her tea while watching the rose bushes she had tended since she was young. She had just set her cup down when something in her view made her hand tremble, the delicate clink of porcelain on the saucer ringing out. And in that instant, the world seemed to tilt. Beneath the rose bushes, their blooms, heavy and soft as velvet, lay a frail, collapsed shape at the edge of the soil. Its head, or rather the entire muzzle and neck, was trapped inside a large, cloudy industrial plastic container, the thing gripping like a suffocating collar. Helen froze for a few seconds, the cold from the kitchen floor seeping through her slippers, pulling her into another memory, one from a spring afternoon less than 6 months earlier, when the air had been light with pollen and lily. Her 7-year-old granddaughter, with hair like spun gold and a smile that could brighten a room, had run laughing through this same garden, tucking small roses into Helen's hair. That memory was both tender and sharp, and in the sight of this creature she felt an unexpected pang, grief for what she had lost, tangled with a fierce sympathy for another life teetering on the edge. She stepped onto the porch, arms instinctively folding over her chest as if to hold her heart together. The rose blooms swayed gently in the breeze, dewdrops still clinging to their petals, catching the morning light in tiny prisms. Beauty so perfect it seemed impossible for death or pain to exist here. Yet right in the middle of it, a life was fading, the dull sheen of the plastic jar reflecting patches of light over fur that might once have gleamed. As Helen drew closer, the mingled smells of stale plastic and sour, stagnant breath hit her, and she knew the dog had been like this for some time. Its coat was a mix of deep brown with black along the back and head, but beneath the fur, the outline of bone was stark, as fragile as a dry twig in winter. There was no fight left in him, just slow, heavy breaths, each one strained by the hard plastic ring that had cinched itself tight around his neck. Helen called over the fence, her voice hoarse, but loud enough to reach the next yard. Moments later, her neighbor Martha Lang appeared, still holding her watering can, water spilling in a thin stream onto the paving stones. When her eyes found the figure under the roses, she froze, eyes widening as the can slipped from her hand, splashing water across the ground. "Oh, Helen," Martha's voice faltered, her hand rising to her mouth. Helen nodded slightly, her gaze fixed on the dog. She could feel some invisible thread linking her to this animal, one that seemed to stretch back into the past, to that day Lily had crouched at the front gate to comfort a stray kitten. She knew she had to act, but her heart was momentarily caught in the strange, familiar pull of that connection. She gestured for Martha to call someone, maybe the veterinary clinic in town. While Martha hurried inside, Helen knelt on the damp ground, her knees sinking into soil still cool with morning dew, and she extended her hand toward the dog. He didn't flinch, only shivered faintly, his amber-brown eyes opening just enough to meet hers through the fogged plastic. That look was not exactly a plea, and not resignation either, but something deeper, weariness carved into its depths, the kind that comes after too many days spent simply holding on to life. "Hello, boy," Helen murmured, her voice so soft it surprised even herself. At that moment, she had no idea that these eyes had witnessed Lily's final moments. No idea that in his memory, the child's face still lingered her smile, her small hand brushing the top of his head just before a terrible sound shattered the quiet street leading to the school. All of that would be revealed only in time. For now, beneath the bright bloom of roses, Helen saw only a creature who needed to be pulled back from the brink. From a distance, Martha's voice called back, "They said they'll send someone, but it might take a while." Helen nodded, feeling a strange determination rising inside her. She hadn't touched a dog in decades, not since a childhood incident had left her wary of them. But now that fear stepped aside for something stronger, she reached for the plastic ring around his neck. Feeling the unyielding thickness, gauging the narrow opening, thinking through how to remove it without causing more pain. The jar was large and solid, the neck narrower than the body, an accidental but perfect trap. Helen knew that pulling it would only drive it deeper. She drew back her hand, breathing in slow and deep, keeping her eyes locked with his. A breeze passed through, stirring the roses and sending their sweet scent into the air, a reminder that beauty and fragility often exist together. Helen thought of those mornings watering plants with Lily, telling her how roses thrived under patience and care. Now, kneeling before this battered life, she felt the same truth to save it. She would need both patience and care, even if time felt short. Somewhere down the road, the sound of an engine began to rise low at first, then clearer. Martha stood and waved toward the gate. Helen stayed where she was, her hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder, willing him to understand that someone was here now, that he was not alone, and that she would try to free him from the stifling grip of the jar. A white pickup pulled up in front of the house, the logo of the local veterinary service on its door. A middle-aged man stepped out, a medical bag over his shoulder, eyes already fixed on the rose bushes. He approached quickly, crouching to assess the situation, then glanced at Helen. "Keep him steady. I'll see what I can do right here," he said. Helen nodded, feeling the faint tremor in the dog's body under her palm. In that instant, a thought brushed the edge of her mind. Why did she feel so connected to him, as if two lost souls had recognized each other in a vast, indifferent world? The vet pulled out a tool, the steel catching the morning light. He gave her a small nod before beginning. The blade touched the plastic and the dog flinched, but didn't try to pull away. His gaze stayed fixed on Helen. In those eyes, she saw the pale blue of the early sky reflected. And somewhere deeper, a shadow of a memory still locked away. The sharp crack of splitting plastic rang out, and as the ring came away, the dog drew in a long, desperate breath, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. Helen pressed her hand gently against his side, feeling the rhythm steady. The vet was talking about moving him to the clinic for fluids and a full exam. But her mind was elsewhere, drawn completely into the silent conversation between them. Between a woman who had just watched life return to another being, and a dog who had been delivered from the edge, carrying within him a story neither yet understood. And as the wheels of the truck rolled slowly away, taking shadow out of the garden, Helen couldn't have known that the path opening for him would lead her straight back into the heart of a mystery, to the very day when Lily's presence had been stolen, and to truths still buried beneath the quiet streets of Fern Hollow. Long before Helen Carter knelt in the damp soil beneath her roses, before the plastic jar became a prison, clamped around his head, Shadow had been a name spoken with respect in the halls of the Fern Hollow Police Department. Under the steady hand of Officer Daniel Ward, he had served as one of the county's most reliable K-9 officers, sharp-eyed, steady-nerved, trained to read the air and follow a scent until it yielded the truth. His dark coat caught the light in rich waves of mahogany and black. His stride held the measured purpose of an animal that understood the value of discipline, and his amber eyes carried the focus of a soldier who had accepted his role in a world that could turn dangerous in an instant. Ward had trusted him with his life, more times than he could count. In 5 years together, they had patrolled quiet neighborhoods, tracked missing hikers through thick forest, and closed cases that might have remained open without Shadow's nose leading the way. He was no ordinary dog. His instincts were sharpened by hours of training and years of working in tense, unpredictable situations. He could read the tremor in a suspect's body before a sudden move, or find the faint trace of a child's scent after a night lost in the cold. It was that same instinct that had led him 6 months earlier to the place where Lily Carter's life ended. On the night of May 15th, the order had come in to search the streets near Fern Hollow Elementary. A child had been struck by a vehicle. The driver had fled. Officer Ward had felt his heart drop at the report, but he gave Shadow the command, and the dog moved forward, nose sweeping the air, body low and focused. He tracked her scent from the edge of the schoolyard to a stretch of road where street lamps pooled their weak light across cracked pavement. There she was, small, still fragile, surrounded by uniforms and flashing lights. Shadow had lowered himself beside her, his body a barrier between her and the cold, his nose pressed near her hair as if memorizing her for all time. In the chaos of that night, Shadow did not know that the boy standing behind the crowd, Trent Whitaker, would soon be at the center of the tragedy. He did not know that the scent of this young man, etched into his memory from a previous traffic stop, would become the key to a truth that others would fight to bury. 3 weeks later, the Whitaker family, wealthy, insulated by their estate on the north end of town, made their move. It began quietly before dawn. A handful of lights glowed in their mansion, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in marble halls, and trunks of expensive luggage thumped into the back of a dark SUV. Trent was pale and silent, his hands shaking as he carried the last bag. The story within those walls was not spoken aloud, but in every glance exchanged, there was urgency. By the time the sun rose, their plan was set. They would leave Fern Hollow, perhaps forever, under the cover of a narrative they could control. There was only one problem, Shadow. For the last year since being retired from the force, after a case that left him with symptoms of stress and anxiety, he had lived on the Whitaker property. On paper, it was a generous arrangement space to roam a high fence, all the resources a well-bred German shepherd might need. In reality, it had been a slow erosion of his spirit. He was no longer given commands that tapped into his skills. He was no longer part of a team. Trent's attention was inconsistent, sometimes a rough pat on the head, other times a sharp word or the cold absence of eye contact. But Shadow still remembered what it meant to have a purpose to guard and protect. And somewhere in the shadows of his mind, the image of Lily's small form on the pavement remained. He had been there when she needed someone, and the instinct to stay near, to keep searching, had never left him. The morning of the Whitakers' departure, Shadow watched from the far corner of the yard as the SUV was loaded, his ears tilted forward when the front door closed for the last time. He waited for the call, the click of the leash, the familiar sign that he would be included. It never came. Instead, the sound of the engine faded down the long drive, and silence spread across the manicured lawn. At first he paced the fence line, nose pressed to the gaps, scanning the air for Trent's scent. The house, once full of faint human sounds, was empty now. The bowls inside the kitchen were dry. The gate that might have been opened for him was locked. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then tilted toward the horizon. Hunger tightened in his belly, but thirst was sharper. He found a shallow puddle near the garden and drank the water warm from the day's heat. That night, alone in the dark, he lay near the porch door, ears lifting at every rustle of leaves or distant car waiting for the sound of return. The first day ended without it. By the second day, Shadow's hunger pushed him to search the property. He nosed through the shed, pawed at the latch of the trash bin, but nothing yielded more than scraps too small to ease the ache. His fur began to lose its gloss, and the rhythm of his tail slowed. Yet he still rose with each new sound, each shift in the wind. Somewhere beyond these walls, someone might need him. It was on the third day that he found the container. The thing had been rolling around the edge of the patio for weeks, a large industrial-grade jar once used to store corn syrup for one of the Whitakers' ill-fated agricultural ventures. The sweet scent still clung to its interior, faint, but enough to stir his hunger into urgency. Shadow approached it, the way he had been trained to approach anything unfamiliar. A slow circle sniffing at the edges, head tilting to catch the scent from different angles. His tongue brushed the rim, catching a trace of syrup. The taste was enough to make his empty stomach clench. He pushed his muzzle further in, lapping at the residue along the curved walls. The trap sprung without malice, but with perfect efficiency. The wide body of the jar gave way to a neck just narrow enough to catch at the base of his skull. When he tried to back out, the hard ring bit into the fur and skin at his throat. He pulled harder, twisting, and felt the squeeze tighten. Instinct took over, thrashing his head, pawing at the jar, shoving against the porch railing. The plastic would not give. Each attempt sent a dull ache through his jaw, a constriction in his breath. He staggered across the yard sides, heaving the world reduced to the muffled thud of his own movements and the dull gray light filtering through scratched plastic. By the fourth day, he no longer tried to remove it. His strength was ebbing. He drank from puddles he could reach, but eating was impossible. The sweetness that had lured him now coated his mouth with a sickly film. His steps grew slow, but his mind, still wired for duty, kept pushing him toward the fence, toward the scent trails carried in on the breeze. On the fifth day, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of something familiar. Human voices, a child's laughter from somewhere beyond the fence. Shadow lifted his head, ears straining, and for a moment his pace quickened. He followed the fence line until the sound faded, then sank down in the grass sides, trembling. By the sixth day, thirst and exhaustion made his vision blur. His coat hung loose on his frame, and each breath rasped in his chest. Yet even in this state, his ears twitched at the distant hum of an engine, the faint slam of a car door, the creak of a gate somewhere in the neighborhood. The patterns of a working life were still imprinted in him, always listening, always watching. On the seventh day, his legs gave way without warning as he moved toward the shade of the rose bushes. The ground there was cool, the scent of earth and flowers sharp through the cloying odor of the jar. He lowered himself onto his side, the world narrowing to the rhythm of his own breath and the thud of his heart in his ears. And still in the dim, muted space behind the plastic images moved through his mind. The glint of sunlight on a child's hair, the warmth of a small hand on his head. The moment before a sudden angry voice broke through. The flash of a vehicle. The final stillness. He had been trained to protect, to search, to stay. Even now, stripped of strength, he was searching in his way for someone to guard, someone to stand beside, a final mission to see through. The world around him was quiet, except for the faint rustle of leaves above. The roses swayed, petals brushing one another like whispers. His eyes, half-lidded, caught a shadow moving beyond the fence, and a voice, soft, unsure, floated toward him. He didn't understand the words, only the tone, the gentle thread in it that told him to hold on just a little longer. 7 days had passed since the Whitakers had driven away, leaving behind their lawn, their locked doors, their secrets, and him. 7 days of hunger, thirst, and the slow closing in of the plastic's grip. But also 7 days of something deeper, the stubborn ember inside him, that refused to go out because somewhere out there was still someone who might need him. And in the hour that followed, that someone would step into the garden, bending down through the perfume of roses, and find him. Helen Carter sat in the worn armchair by her front window. A thin throw blanket pooled over her knees, the steam from her second cup of tea curling into the cool morning air. Beyond the glass, the rose bushes stood like silent sentinels, their petals shifting gently in the breeze. But she wasn't looking at the roses anymore. Her gaze drifted inward, replaying a moment she couldn't seem to escape, the look in Shadow's eyes when she first knelt beside him. It had been only a day since the vet's truck had carried him away from her garden, yet those eyes followed her everywhere. amber clouded with exhaustion, yet holding something that was not mere animal instinct. There had been a depth there, a memory that seemed almost human in its weight. Helen had spent most of her life reading the emotions of others, her former students, the neighbors, the few friends who had stayed in touch, and she knew the language of eyes. Shadow's gaze spoke of loneliness, of loss, and of some story no one had yet asked him to tell. That gaze also stirred something else, something she had spent 20 years burying under the routines of a quiet life, the ache of a rift that had never healed. Her daughter Alice. It had been 2 decades since their voices last held warmth for each other. Alice, barely 20 back then, had chosen to study veterinary medicine instead of following the path Helen had dreamed for her human medicine, the kind of career Helen had thought would keep her daughter close, respected, secure. The argument that ended it all had started over a simple dinner table conversation and ended with doors slammed and a suitcase dragged out to the curb. Words had been said that neither of them could unsay. In the years since Helen had watched her daughter's life from a distance through fragments in the local paper, when Alice opened her first practice in another county through whispers from acquaintances who had seen her at conferences, through the occasional photograph passed along by someone who didn't know they were delivering a small wound. And then Lily was born, Helen's granddaughter. She had met the child only a handful of times, each visit careful brief arranged through the diplomacy of others. Yet in those moments, Lily's presence had been like sunlight breaking through a cloud bank. Bright open, unafraid of the walls, adults built between themselves. She had a laugh that made the garden seem warmer even in winter. Now Lily was gone, and Shadow's eyes had pulled Helen back into the hollow left behind, not just by the child, but by all the years of silence with Alice. The ring of the telephone startled her from the thought. She reached for it slowly, half expecting another neighbor calling to discuss the injured dog. Instead, it was a voice she knew immediately, though it had grown deeper since she'd last heard it in person. "Grandma Noah," she breathed, gripping the receiver a little tighter. Her grandson's voice was threaded with a heaviness that didn't belong to someone of 16. "Mom thinks I should come stay with you for a while. He hesitated, and she could hear the faint sound of traffic through the line. "I can't stop thinking about Lily, about how I should have been there. I keep telling myself I could have walked her home, and she'd still." The sentence cracked in 2, the rest unspoken but clear. Helen closed her eyes, pressing her free hand to her forehead. "Noah," she said softly, "you loved her." She knew that. But love didn't protect her. He replied the words sharp with guilt. "I was her big brother. I told her I'd always look out for her. And that day, I didn't." Helen wanted to gather him in her arms to shake him free from that terrible weight. But the miles between Minneapolis and Fern Hollow made her voice her only reach. "Come here," she told him. "Come and we'll figure this out together. Lily wouldn't want you to carry this alone." When the call ended, Helen sat for a long time in silence, the phone still warm in her hand. First, Alice's voice missing from her life for years now. Noah's full of grief, 2 different shapes of absence both pressing in on her. Outside, the wind picked up, bending the stems of the roses. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shape slipping between the trees across the road. Her breath caught. Shadow. He was moving like a ghost, his frame thin but still upright, the bandages around his neck stark against the dark fur. The vet must have released him for a short period, or perhaps he had found his own way out into the streets. His head was low tail, held at half-mast, the way dogs carry themselves when they are searching for something they can't name. Helen watched him from the window, a lump rising in her throat. In the shifting morning light, his outline seemed almost to blur into the mist, one moment solid, the next a suggestion. He passed the corner bakery without glancing toward the open door, crossed Main Street at a steady trot, and disappeared between the brick fronts of 2 shuttered shops. People in town had started talking. A few had seen him at dawn, padding down quiet lanes as if he had a destination. Others said he appeared in one place and was gone the next, like he could slip between shadows at will. There was a kind of reverence in the way they spoke of him. Though it was laced with curiosity, no one knew where he went or why. Helen leaned back in her chair, the image of his wandering form staying with her. A dog like that didn't just roam. He was looking. Whether it was for a person, a place, or something lost, she couldn't tell. But she recognized the restlessness, the way it pulled at the edges of a life. It was the same restlessness that had driven Alice away all those years ago. The same pull that now made Noah want to leave the city for her small house at the edge of town. Somewhere woven between the fractured lines of her family and the silent path of that dog was a story that bound them all together. Helen didn't yet know what it was, but she could feel it in the quiet moments, in the way her heart tightened when she thought of Shadow's eyes. And as afternoon light stretched across the floorboards, painting long golden shapes, she understood that the next time she saw him, she wouldn't just watch from the window. She would go to him, even if it meant stepping directly into the unanswered questions he carried with him. Because there was something in the way he moved, steady, searching, unwilling to stop, that made her believe that his story, however tangled, was already tangled with hers. And she needed to know where it led. The morning air carried a sharpened chill, the kind that seemed to slip through the seams of the house and find its way into the joints. Helen Carter stood at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since lost its warmth. Outside, the light was thin, the pale gold of a sun struggling to push through a low ceiling of clouds. Breath fogged faintly on the glass as she leaned forward, scanning the frost-tipped edges of the garden. She had been awake since before dawn, pacing the kitchen as if her body knew there was something waiting. It wasn't just the cold that had kept her restless. It was the quiet conviction that today she would not simply stand behind the safety of her window if she saw him again. The fear had been with her since she was 7. Since the day a neighbor's chained dog had lunged without warning, its bark ringing in her ears long after her uncle had pulled her to safety. The memory had calcified into something immovable, a reflexive stiffness in her spine whenever she saw certain shapes, heard certain sounds. For decades she had let that fear decide her distance from any animal with a broad chest and strong jaw. But Shadow's eyes, those eyes had been haunting her. They weren't the eyes of an unpredictable beast. They were the eyes of a soldier left on the wrong side of a battlefield. If she could look into them and see sorrow rather than threat, then maybe the fear no longer deserved the grip it had kept on her life. She pulled on her coat, the wool brushing against her neck, and stepped out into the cold. The air met her face with a sting, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. She crossed the porch and moved toward the garden, her breath coming in small clouds. That was when she heard it, a low, uneven rasp that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Her gaze dropped to the far side of the rose bushes. There he was. Shadow lay crumpled in the frost-kissed grass, his body drawn tight as if to serve the last of his warmth. The bandages around his neck were damp, darkened at the edges. His breaths were shallow, the sound of them rattling like an old engine failing to catch. Helen's heart jolted, the old reflex of fear pricking at her skin. But something deeper surged past it. She moved without calculation, kneeling into the cold earth until the damp seeped through her trousers. "Hey," she whispered the word, a thread in the air. "It's all right now." She reached out a tentative hand, letting it hover just above his flank. She could feel the slight tremor in his ribs, the fragile rise and fall of his breath. Her other hand went instinctively to the scarf at her neck, tugging it free to lay it over his side. It was absurd the scarf would do little to warm him, but the act grounded her, reminded her that she was here to protect, not recoil. The quiet was shattered by a sound Helen hadn't heard in 20 years, her own voice breaking into a sharp cry. It tore from her throat before she realized it had risen a plea that was part fear, part urgency. Across town, Alice Carter had been walking toward the small market with a paper bag of supplies tucked under her arm. She had been back in Fern Hollow for just under 3 weeks, a return she had not announced to anyone, except the realtor who had rented her a small apartment above the veterinary clinic she was set to take over. The plan had been to keep her distance for a while, ease into the rhythms of the town without colliding with the past too soon. But when she heard that cry carry across the still morning, the sound slid under her ribs in a way that made her legs move before her mind caught up. She knew that voice. She dropped the bag without care for the apples rolling into the gutter and ran. Her boots hit the edge of Helen's property just as she rounded the hedgerow and saw them. Her mother bent low over the dark shape of a dog, hands uncertain but determined. The dog himself barely lifting his head, his breath a wet rattle in the cold. Alice's own breath came sharp from the sprint. But her training, long dormant under years of professional composure, rose to the surface in an instant. "Don't move him," she said, her voice clipped steady. "Let me see." Helen looked up, and the air between them shifted. The years of silence, of words unsent and calls unanswered, hung suspended in that gaze. Helen's eyes were already wet, though, whether from the cold or the sight of her daughter standing there. Alice couldn't tell. Alice, Helen breathed the syllables weighted with everything she hadn't said for 2 decades. Alice knelt without answering, her hands already at the dog's neck, fingers probing gently around the bandages. Shadow flinched once, but her voice came low. A practiced murmur of reassurance, and he stilled. "He's barely breathing," she said, eyes narrowing as she assessed the pallor of his gums, the sluggish blink of his eyes. "We need to get him to the clinic now, or we'll lose him." Helen's hands tightened on the scarf. "Tell me what to do." The words were simple, but Alice felt them land somewhere deep, like the first bridge plank laid over a chasm. She swallowed, her own voice softening. "Help me lift him. Support his head. Keep his neck straight." They moved together, awkward at first, then in sync, as if their bodies remembered a time when they had not stood on opposite sides of an argument. Shadow was lighter than Helen expected. The loss of weight was its own kind of warning. His head lolled slightly, but she adjusted her grip until it rested against her forearm. As they carried him toward the street, Helen's breath came in shallow bursts, not from the effort, but from the press of memory. The last time she had carried anything this fragile had been Lily asleep in her arms after a summer picnic. She felt the sting behind her eyes and didn't fight it. Alice glanced sideways, once catching the movement of her mother's expression. She didn't comment, but she felt her own throat tighten. This was not how she had imagined their first words in 20 years would come over the body of a dog hovering at the edge of life. But here they were bound by an urgency that left no space for pride. By the time they reached the curb, Alice's truck was already there. She had left it idling earlier while unloading supplies. She swung the passenger door open, spreading a blanket over the seat in one motion. "Lay him down gently, head toward me." Helen followed her hands, slow, reluctant to release the warmth she was lending him. Once Shadow was settled, Alice moved around to the driver's side. Helen hesitated, then climbed in after him, pressing herself into the corner so she could keep one hand on his side. The drive was short, but felt impossibly long. The hum of the engine filled the cab, broken only by the faint, uneven sound of Shadow's breathing. Helen watched each rise and fall of his ribs, willing the next one to come. When they reached the clinic, Alice jumped out first, circling to open Helen's door. Together they lifted Shadow again this time, into the bright sterility of the exam room. The smell of antiseptic rose to meet them, mingled with the faint scent of hay from the feed store next door. Alice's voice shifted fully into professional command. I need IV fluids, warming blankets, oxygen. She stopped herself, glancing at Helen. Stay here. Keep talking to him. He knows your voice now. Helen nodded, her hand smoothing gently over the curve of his shoulder. She spoke without thinking the words, more comfort to herself than anything. You're not alone anymore, Shadow. You've got people who'll fight for you. Alice worked quickly, slipping a catheter into the vein, adjusting the oxygen mask to fit over his muzzle, without pressing on the raw skin beneath the bandages. She checked his pulse, her brows knitting, then glanced at her mother again. He's critical, she said quietly. But he's got a chance. Something in Helen's chest eased. Not relief exactly, but the loosening of a knot that had been tightening since she'd first seen him under the roses. She let out a long breath, her eyes meeting Alice's. Thank you, she said. Alice held the gaze for a moment longer than necessary before looking back to her patient. We'll need to watch him closely for the next few hours. Infection, dehydration, there's a lot to fight off. Helen moved to stand beside her daughter. The space between them narrowed now to the width of a veterinary table, and the life they were both trying to save. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something in understanding that they were, for the first time in a very long while, on the same side. Shadow stirred faintly under the blanket, his paw twitching, as if chasing something in a dream. Both women glanced down at the same moment. Helen's fingers brushed against Alice's where they rested near his side, and neither of them pulled away. The clock on the wall ticked forward, marking the fragile stretch of time in which a life hung suspended. Outside, the cold morning deepened into a pale afternoon. Inside, a mother and daughter stood shoulder to shoulder, bound together by a shared decision they would not let him slip away. And in that sterile room, with the soft hiss of oxygen and the steady drip of fluids as their soundtrack, something long dormant between them, began cautiously to breathe again. It was in that quiet, before either dared speak of the past, before they knew the whole truth about the dog they were saving, that the sound of hurried footsteps approached the clinic door, carrying with them news that would draw both women deeper into the web of Shadow's story. The small veterinary clinic on the corner of Maple and First had stood in Fern Hollow for decades, its red brick exterior faded by sun and snow, its windows fogged in winter from the hum of heaters inside. Tonight, however, the light spilling from those windows was almost startling, sharp, steady, unwavering against the darkness outside. Inside, the air was brisk with antiseptic, the faint tang of iodine mixing with the metallic scent of clean steel. Alice Carter stood scrubbed in her hair, pulled back tight beneath a disposable cap, the green fabric of her surgical gown rustling each time she moved. The old exam room, with its scuffed tile and cabinets painted a dull cream, had been transformed into an operating space. A portable surgical lamp, bright as a midsummer sun, cast a perfect circle of white over the table where Shadow lay. The dog's breaths came in shallow, intermittent pulls, each one a small labor. The plastic jar had been removed hours earlier, but its damage lingered deep grooves in the skin around his neck, raw and inflamed, and the deeper problem how close he was to complete organ failure from dehydration and starvation. Alice's hands moved with a precision that came from years of practice. She wasn't thinking about the fractured relationship with her mother that had brought her back into this building. She wasn't thinking about the 20 years of silence. She was thinking about Shadow, about keeping him tethered to this world for just a little longer. Clamp, she said softly, and her assistant, a local vet tech named Miriam, placed the instrument into her waiting hand. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the only sound that kept Alice's own pulse from running away from her. Every beat that echoed from the machine was a reminder he's still here, he's still fighting. Outside the clinic, headlights swept briefly across the frosted street before a dark sedan pulled into the small parking lot. Reverend Paul Mason stepped out first, adjusting his scarf against the bite of the evening air. Behind him came Noah Carter, his hood pulled low, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. The boy had been silent for most of the drive, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But his mind had been crowded with images, Lily's laugh the way she used to race him to the corner store, and the gnawing thought that he should have been there on the day she didn't come home. Reverend Paul locked the car and glanced toward the lit windows. "She's in there now," he said, his voice calm but threaded with gravity. "And so is that dog you told me about?" Noah nodded, his throat tight. "Shadow," he said quietly, as if the name itself might break. When they stepped inside, the waiting area smelled faintly of chamomile from the tea someone had left cooling on the counter. Helen sat in one of the vinyl chairs, her coat draped over her lap, her hands folded as though in prayer. She looked up at the sound of the door, her eyes softening at the sight of Noah. "You came," she murmured, rising to wrap him in her arms. He let himself fold into the embrace for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of her wool coat, and then she released him so she could clasp Reverend Paul's hands. "They're still in surgery," Helen said. "It's been nearly 2 hours." Noah glanced toward the closed door at the end of the hall, beyond which the bright light spilled out in a thin, unwavering beam. He had never seen a veterinary surgery before, but in his mind the room looked almost like the human hospital rooms he'd visited after sports injuries, sterile, bright, and charged with the unspoken question of survival. Inside, Alice was closing the last of the sutures along a line where an abscess had begun to form beneath the torn skin. "Easy boy," she murmured, though he was under anesthesia and could not hear her. Still, the habit of speaking to her patients had never left her. The IV pump clicked softly as fluids flowed into his foreleg. She adjusted the oxygen mask, noting with relief that his chest was rising more steadily now, the violent hitch in each breath easing. "He's holding," she said, finally the words almost a whisper of disbelief. Helen looked up sharply as the door swung open and Miriam stepped out, tugging off her gloves. "They're finishing now," the tech said, her tired smile faint but real. "He's made it through the surgery." Helen exhaled, the tension in her shoulders loosening. Reverend Paul murmured a quiet, "Thank God," and Noah found that his knees felt oddly unsteady, as if the news had taken weight from them. When Alice appeared a few minutes later, she had pulled down her mask, her face pale but glowing with a quiet, hard-earned satisfaction. "He's not out of danger," she cautioned, "but we've stabilized him. The next 24 hours will tell us more." They followed her into the recovery room, where Shadow lay swaddled in warmed blankets, the IV still taped in place, his head resting on a folded towel. In the bright light, his fur looked patchy, the shaved areas revealing the delicate contours of bone beneath. But his breaths, though slow, were steady. Noah stepped closer, his hand hovering just above the dog's head. "He doesn't look like he should even be alive," he said softly. "That's the thing about survivors," Reverend Paul replied. "They often look like this fragile at first glance. But there's more in them than you can see." Helen moved to the other side of the table, her fingers brushing gently over Shadow's flank. His ear twitched faintly at the contact, and her heart skipped in answer. As they stood there, the conversation began to circle around what no one had fully voiced yet. There was something unusual about this dog, not just his size or bearing, but the way he carried himself even in stillness. "I've been around enough rescues to know when one has history," Alice said, adjusting the monitoring equipment. "Look at his muscle tone, even with the weight loss, the way his teeth have been cared for. This isn't a random stray. He's been trained well." Reverend Paul tilted his head. "Police, military?" Alice nodded slowly. "Most likely. See this?" She gestured to a faint scar running along his shoulder. "Surgical repair. That's the kind of procedure you'd see in a working dog, not a pet. And there's another here by the hip, likely from a K9 service injury." Noah's brow furrowed. "So, he used to work for someone?" "Yes," Alice said, her tone measured. And whoever it was, they invested in him. He would have had a handler, a role of life with structure. She hesitated before adding, which makes his abandonment even stranger. Helen exchanged a glance with Reverend Paul. In her mind, the image of Shadow walking the edges of Fern Hollow's streets took on new meaning. He hadn't been wandering without aim, he'd been searching. And if Alice was right, he might have been looking for more than food or shelter. Noah's voice was quiet but certain. He's not just some dog we happen to find. He's connected to something. Maybe even to... He trailed off the name he didn't want to say, pressing at the back of his throat, Lily. The room fell into a gentle silence, broken only by the slow beep of the monitor and the occasional rustle of shadows shifting under the blankets. Alice checked the IV one last time, then looked at each of them in turn. For tonight, the priority is keeping him warm, hydrated, and calm. But after that... She let the thought hang. They all knew it was a question of finding out who he had been before the frost, the hunger, the jar around his head. Helen kept her hand on Shadow's side, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. The bright light above cast a halo across his fur. And for a fleeting moment, she thought of it not as a surgical lamp, but as something softer, an illumination that made space for miracles. And in that light, she felt the first spark of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Since Lily's death, the sense that there was still a thread, however thin, connecting the present to a truth that needed to be found. Outside, the cold night pressed against the windows. Inside, in the small room of bright light, a dog's chest rose and fell. A family stood a little closer together, and the shape of an untold story began to form in the stillness between heartbeats. Somewhere in that stillness, Helen knew lay the answer to why Shadow had come to her garden, and perhaps to the question that had haunted her since the day Lily was taken. The morning light came into the clinic in soft fragments, slipping through the narrow blinds and pooling over the recovery table where Shadow lay. The sharp scent of antiseptic still hung in the air, softened only by the faint aroma of the herbal tea Helen had brought earlier and left cooling near the window. In the stillness, the rhythmic sound of Shadow's breathing filled the room, steady now, no longer the desperate rasp of the night before. Alice leaned over him, her gloved hands moving with careful precision. The clippers hummed in a low, constant tone as she worked her way along his side. The patchy shave from the surgery had been necessary to treat his wounds, but now she needed a more thorough inspection. The fur came away in soft tufts, revealing skin marked by a map of scars. Some old faint lines that had long since healed, others, newer, darker, edged with the slight redness of recent injury. "Hold still, big guy," Alice murmured, her voice softened by the kind of tenderness reserved for creatures who have fought too hard for too long. Helen, seated in a chair nearby, found her eyes tracing each scar as if they were lines of a story she could not yet read. There was one along the shoulder, a clean, straight line that spoke of surgical intervention. Another near the flank, the kind of injury she imagined could only have come from something sharp and fast-moving. She caught herself holding her breath, the image of Lily's final night stirring again like a shadow beneath the surface of her mind. Miriam, the vet tech, leaned in from the other side, pointing to a raised mark near Shadow's ribcage. "That's from a microchip implant," she said. "We can scan it later. If it's still active, it might tell us where he came from." Alice nodded but kept her focus on the work. "These scars," she said quietly, "aren't from random accidents. They're from controlled situations, surgeries, treatments, the kind of care you give to a valuable working dog. Look here, this muscle density. Even with all the weight he's lost, you can see it in the hindquarters. And the way his nails are worn, he's done a lot of pavement work. This dog has trained, worked, and been deployed." Helen shifted in her chair, her hands nodding in her lap. "You mean like a police dog?" Alice's eyes flicked up briefly, confirming without hesitation. "K9 unit, almost certainly." The room was quiet for a moment, as if the words had opened a door none of them had expected to see behind. From the doorway, a voice carried softly into the stillness. After Lily's accident, there were dogs. They all turned. Reverend Paul stood there, his coat still draped over one arm, the chill of the outside air lingering on his skin. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes not leaving Shadow. "I remember it clearly." He continued, his voice low and measured. "The night she died, the police sealed off the intersection. There was glass on the asphalt, the smell of gasoline in the cold air. I saw them bring in 2 canines to search the area, big German shepherds, trained, focused. One of them, he had eyes like this one." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "You saw him?" Paul nodded. Not up close, but enough to remember. It was the way he moved, alert, precise, like every step was part of a job he'd done 100 times. "I didn't think much of it then. But now..." His gaze shifted from Shadow to Helen. "Now I think this might be the same dog." Alice's hand stilled on the clippers. If that's true, it means he was there that night. He could have seen what happened. Noah, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned sharply. "Are you saying Shadow could be the only one who knows the truth about Lily's death?" Helen's heart pounded in her chest. She could see Lily's face as clearly as if her granddaughter were standing before her. Her bright hair whipping in the winter wind, her laugh spilling into the night. And then the memory dissolved into the blur of sirens, the flash of lights, the way the cold seemed to burn rather than freeze. Paul stepped closer to the table, his eyes fixed on Shadow's face. If he was with his handler that night, he would have been right there when it happened. And if the family who left him behind was connected to it, then they might have wanted him gone for a reason. Alice leaned back slightly, her mind already moving through the possibilities. If he's microchipped and still registered, we could trace him to his original handler. Police dogs have detailed records, training logs, deployments, medical histories. We could find out exactly where he was assigned the night Lily died. Noah's voice was tense, urgent. "So let's do it. Scan the chip, find out who he belonged to." Miriam glanced at Alice, who nodded. She fetched the handheld scanner from a drawer, its small screen glowing blue as she powered it on. The device emitted a faint beep with each pass over Shadow's side. For a moment there was nothing. Then a sharp tone and a string of numbers appeared on the screen. Alice read them aloud, then wrote them down. "We can run this through the database," she said. "It'll take some calls, but we'll know soon enough." Helen reached for the edge of the table, her fingers brushing against Shadow's paw. His eyes flickered open briefly, the amber glint catching in the morning light. For the first time since she'd found him under the rose bush, she felt as though he was looking directly at her, as if he recognized something in her that had nothing to do with food or shelter. Paul watched the exchange, his thoughts heavy but certain. If he is the dog I think he is, then he's more than just a survivor. He's a witness, and witnesses, they carry truths that others have tried to bury. Alice began to clean and dress the last of Shadow's wounds, her movements methodical, her mind replaying Reverend Paul's words. The truth lay somewhere beneath all of this, beneath the scars, beneath the shaved fur, beneath the weeks of hunger and abandonment. And it was a truth that someone somewhere might not want them to uncover. Outside, the morning sun broke free of the clouds, casting a pale gold across the snow-lined street. Inside, Shadow lay wrapped in warmth, his breathing, even his body slowly reclaiming strength. But in the room with him, no one missed the shift that had taken place. What had begun as an act of rescue had turned into something else entirely, a thread that could lead straight back to the night Lily's life ended. And as Helen looked down at him, she could not shake the feeling that he was waiting for them to see what he had carried with him all this time. Somewhere in the quiet hum of the clinic, in the gentle press of sunlight against the window, The first pieces of a long-buried truth had begun to surface. And with them came the unspoken certainty that whatever they found next could change everything. The late afternoon sun slanted through the frosted windows of the clinic, painting long, honey-colored bars across the floor. Shadow was resting on the padded table, the faint rise and fall of his chest marking the steady rhythm of a creature reclaiming strength one breath at a time. Helen sat nearby, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her gaze never straying far from him. The bell over the front door chimed a gentle sound that belied the weight carried in by the man who stepped through. His figure was broad-shouldered, his dark winter coat dusted with melting snow, his presence filling the narrow hallway before he even spoke. "Alice Carter?" he asked, his voice deep, steady, but with an undertone of something heavier, grief perhaps, or memory. Alice emerged from the treatment room, wiping her hands on a clean towel. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for recognition. "Yes. And you are?" The man stepped forward and extended a hand. "Ward. Officer David Ward. Retired now. I heard you found a German shepherd in bad shape." Helen rose slowly from her chair. "We did. His name's Shadow. At least that's what we've been calling him." Ward's gaze shifted past them to the recovery table. The moment his eyes landed on Shadow, something in his expression broke just slightly, but enough for Helen to see it. He stepped closer, the sound of his boots soft against the worn floor. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply stood there, studying the dog, as if the years between them were a fog he could part with sheer will. Then, in a voice that was both hoarse and certain, he said, "That's him. That's my partner." Helen felt her chest tighten. Your partner, Ward nodded, moving closer until he was beside the table. He reached out his hand, hovering just above Shadow's head, before finally resting gently between his ears. "We called him Ace in the unit. Best K9 I ever worked with. Smart, loyal, fearless. I thought I'd never see him again." Shadow's eyes flickered open, and for the first time since Helen had met him, his gaze carried recognition. It wasn't the wary glance of a dog measuring a stranger. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement, a thread pulled taut across time. His tail gave a faint, hesitant thump against the blanket. Alice stepped closer. "You know him well, then. Can you tell us where he's been?" "What happened?" Ward drew in a slow breath, his eyes never leaving Shadow. 2 years ago, Ace was assigned to me full-time. We worked narcotics, search and rescue, and on that night scene, security. The night Lily Carter died. Helen's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. She didn't interrupt, though her heart seemed to echo each of his words. "We were called in after a hit-and-run," Ward continued. "It was late, the air was freezing, and the road was slick. I remember the flashing lights, turning the snow pink and blue. When we got there, Lily had already been taken to the hospital. But she didn't make it. My job was to secure the area, look for evidence. Ace Shadow was the first to find her belongings scattered near the ditch. And when we expanded the search, he was the one who found her body after she'd been thrown clear of the impact." Helen's breath hitched, the image too vivid to hold without pain. Ward's voice was steady, but the weight of that night pressed into every syllable. "I'll never forget the way he lay down beside her until I called him back. That's the kind of dog he is, loyal past reason." Noah, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. "And the driver? Was he caught?" Ward's jaw tightened. "We had a suspect. Trent Whitaker, 28th son of the Whitaker family who owned the shipping company out by the industrial park. Witnesses placed his truck near the scene, and there was damage on the vehicle consistent with the collision. But before we could bring him in, the Whitakers lawyered up. Trent vanished for a while. The family had connections, resources, and more importantly, They had motive to make inconvenient evidence disappear. Alice frowned. By inconvenient evidence, you mean? Ward glanced down at Shadow, his hand still resting lightly on the dog's head. A K9 who could track scents, identify where Trent had been, maybe even pick him out in a lineup. Ace was a threat to them. Not because he could talk, but because his skills could point straight to the truth. Helen's voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. Are you saying they got rid of him? Ward's gaze hardened. I'm saying Ace went missing from my yard one night less than a week after the investigation stalled. No forced entry, no signs of a fight. Just gone. The official report called it theft or a runaway. But I knew better. The Whitakers wanted every lead buried, and they buried my partner along with it. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the soft hum of the heating vent. Alice crossed her arms, her mind racing. If Shadow Ace was taken to keep him from being used as evidence, then finding him now could reopen the case. Ward nodded slowly. Maybe. But after this much time, it's uphill work. Memories fade. Witnesses change their stories. And dogs, they get older. But Ace, he remembers. I can see it in him. Shadow shifted slightly on the table, his ears angling toward Ward's voice. There was no mistaking the subtle change in posture, the way his muscles tightened, the faint spark in his eyes. Helen swallowed her throat tight. Why didn't you come forward sooner if you knew the Whitakers had taken him? I tried, Ward interrupted gently. But without proof, it was just a retired cop pointing fingers at a wealthy family. The department wouldn't touch it. And then when I left the force, I had even less pull. But now he's here. And maybe that means the truth can be too. Noah looked from Ward to Helen, his voice edged with urgency. If we can connect Shadow to that night, it's not just about justice for Lily. It's about making sure they can't do this to anyone else. Ward straightened his eyes, meeting Helen's. You should know bringing this up again will stir trouble. The Whitakers don't forget. And they don't forgive. If they hear Ace is alive, they'll come looking. That's the kind of people they are. Helen's gaze dropped to Shadow, his amber eyes steady beneath the dim clinic light. For so long she had seen only the frail, starving dog she'd pulled from under the rosebush. Now she saw the soldier beneath the disciplined, unyielding presence of a protector who had never abandoned his post even when the world had abandoned him. She lifted her chin. Then we keep him safe. Whatever it takes. Ward's hand lingered a moment longer on Shadow's head. Then he stepped back. He's earned that much and more. Outside, the sun had dipped low, staining the snow with a faint wash of gold and violet. Inside, the air felt charged, as if some unspoken pact had just been formed. The threads of past and present were weaving together now, tighter with each revelation, pulling them towards something none of them could yet see in full. Shadow closed his eyes again, but not in the deep, surrendering sleep of exhaustion. This was a lighter rest, one ear tilted toward the room, his body still attuned to the voices around him. The silenced protector had been found. But his story was far from finished, and the moment the wrong ears caught wind of his return, the quiet they had now would be gone. And somewhere beyond the clinic walls, in a house where the lights burned too bright against the winter night, the Whitakers were about to hear a piece of news they had spent years trying to erase. The morning the letter arrived, the air outside the Carter home was brittle with frost, the sort that clung to the edges of windows like pale lace. Helen stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, when she heard the thud of the postman's boots on the porch and the quick shuffle of envelopes sliding through the slot. She didn't think much of it until she saw the envelope at the top of the stack. Heavy paper-embossed return address in dark green ink, Whitaker and Holt attorneys at law. Her stomach tightened as she tore it open. The words were cold, efficient, stripped of anything human. The Whitaker family claimed legal ownership of the German Shepherd found on her property. They alleged that the dog referred to in the letter by his original name, Ace, had been unlawfully detained and demanded his immediate return. They cited documentation, pedigree records, and canine training certifications, all neatly attached in photocopied form. The letter concluded with a polite but unmistakable threat: failure to comply would result in legal action. Helen read it twice, the sharp edges of each sentence pressing against her chest. She thought of Shadow, of the way he had arrived in her garden, frail and silent, a ghost in the shape of a dog, and felt the cold press deeper. By the time Alice arrived at the clinic, Helen had the letter spread across the counter. Reverend Paul was already there, leaning against the wall with a deep frown, and Noah stood near the doorway, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat. Alice read the letter, her jaw tightening. "They've been waiting for this," she said finally. "Ward warned us. The moment they knew Shadow was alive, they'd try to reclaim him, to control him again." Noah's voice was sharp. They didn't care if he starved under some rose bush for months, but now they want him back. That's not about love. That's about keeping him quiet. Helen glanced toward the recovery room where Shadow was resting. "They're sending someone today," she said quietly. "A veterinarian, to assess his health and transport him." The words tasted wrong in her mouth. Transport him, like he was cargo. It was just after noon when the sound of a car door closing broke the tense quiet. Through the frosted glass of the clinic door, Helen saw a man approaching mid-50s with neat silver hair and a pressed brown overcoat. He carried a leather satchel in one hand, his other hand tucked into his pocket against the cold. The door chimed as he stepped inside. "Mrs. Carter, I'm Dr. Merton. I've been asked to retrieve a dog in your care. Ace." Helen met his gaze evenly. "His name is Shadow now." Dr. Merton gave a polite smile, the kind professionals wear when they want to avoid argument. "Of course. May I see him?" Alice appeared at Helen's side. "You can see him," she said. "But you should know he's been through a lot. And this isn't a kennel transfer. He's part of a family now." The vet inclined his head as if he understood, but his eyes were already scanning the clinic, looking for the door to the recovery room. Helen led him through. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. Shadow lay on a blanket, his head resting on his paws. At the sound of footsteps, his ears twitched and he lifted his head. "Hello, boy," Dr. Merton said gently, crouching down. He extended a hand palm down in the universal greeting of strangers to dogs. Shadow sniffed the air but didn't move forward. The vet reached for his satchel, pulling out a slip lead. "Let's get you home." That was when Shadow stood. Not suddenly, not with alarm, but with a deliberate, slow rise. His eyes were steady amber, catching the winter light. He looked at the slip lead, then at Helen, then back at the vet. And then, with a quiet decisiveness, he stepped away from Merton entirely and walked toward Helen. The room stilled. Shadow stopped at her side, his flank brushing her leg, his head tilting slightly upward as if awaiting a cue. Helen looked down into those eyes and saw not fear, not confusion, but something clear and unshakable. Dr. Merton hesitated. "Mrs. Carter, he's responding to you because you've been caring for him. But dogs adapt. He'll be fine once he's settled again." But Helen knew better. This wasn't adaptation. This was choice. And then Shadow made it clear. Without breaking eye contact with Helen, he shifted his stance, front paws, square shoulders tense, and gave a sharp, deliberate motion of his head. It was a gesture Alice recognized instantly. "It's a refusal signal," she said quietly. Dr. Merton looked up. "A what canine training?" Alice explained. "Handlers use silent cues. A certain head turn, a weight shift, it's the dog's way of saying negative or Stand down. He's telling you no. Shadow held the position for a beat longer, then moved closer to Helen, sitting with precision at her side. The contact was subtle, but it was a statement. I am with her. Noah exhaled slowly, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Guess that answers that. The vet straightened his polite expression, faltering. I can't force him. But the Whitakers will pursue this. Helen rested her hand lightly on Shadow's neck. Then let them. He's not a piece of property to be shuffled from place to place. He has the right to stay where he's safe, Durant. Merton gathered his satchel. I'll have to report that he wouldn't comply. Report whatever you like, Alice said, her voice firm. But make sure you write down that it was his choice. The vet gave a small nod, almost as if he respected the outcome, and left without further argument. The sound of his car starting drifted in through the frosted windows, then faded down the road. The silence that followed was heavy, but charged with something new, something that felt like resolve. Shadow had spoken in the only language he knew, and it had been impossible to ignore. Helen knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the line of fur along his neck. You stayed. Shadow's tail moved once against the floor. His eyes softened, but the alertness remained a readiness that belonged to a dog who had chosen his post. Alice crossed her arms, a small smile breaking through her usual reserve. If the Whitakers thought they could just walk in and take him, they don't understand what kind of bond they're up against. Reverend Paul, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. Sometimes the loudest testimony doesn't come from words. It comes from where you stand and who you stand beside. Helen looked around the room, taking in their faces. For the first time since the day she'd found him under the rose bush, she felt a shift, not just in Shadow, but in herself. This wasn't about pity anymore. This was about partnership, about shared ground. Outside, the frost had begun to melt thin rivulets of water tracing down the clinic windows. Inside, Shadow settled into a relaxed sit, his eyes still moving between them, as if memorizing the shape of this moment. The Whitakers would come again, that much was certain, but now, Helen understood something she hadn't before. Shadow wasn't a silent witness. He was an active defender, and he had made his choice. And when the choice belongs to a dog like him, no court order or polished lawyer's letter could erase it. Somewhere far from the warmth of the clinic, the Whitaker estate stood like a fortress against the winter wind. And within its walls, the news of Shadow's defiance was about to land like a stone breaking glass. The attic smelled faintly of cedar and dust, a dry scent that clung to the tongue and coated the air with the stillness of years. Noah had come up here on a late afternoon when the light slanted low through the west window, throwing long amber beams across the stacked boxes and forgotten furniture. Helen had told him the boxes were mostly old Christmas decorations, unused linens, and albums she could not bring herself to throw away. But Noah wasn't looking for tinsel or blankets. He was looking for Lily. Since the day Shadow had chosen to stay, something restless had taken root in him, a need to connect the pieces that had remained scattered for too long. There were still shadows in the story, still unanswered questions. Officer Ward's account, the Whitakers' cold determination, and now the quiet certainty in Shadow's eyes, all seemed to point in the same direction. But the picture wasn't complete. Noah ran his hand along the spines of old binders and boxes until his fingers brushed something different. A small fabric-bound notebook tucked between two heavy photo albums. The cover was pale blue, worn at the edges, with a faded sticker of a yellow daisy at the corner. When he opened it, the smell of paper and ink rose up, and his chest tightened. Lily's handwriting filled the first page, rounded, a little slanted, each loop and curve instantly familiar. He sat down on the attic floor, cross-legged, and began to read. March 14th. It's cold today, but the sun is out, and I walked past the Whitakers' yard on my way to the bus stop. There's a German Shepherd there now, tied to a post near the fence. He's so beautiful, black and tan, with eyes like honey. But he's so thin I can see the shapes of his ribs. I don't think they feed him enough. He didn't bark when I walked by. He just looked at me. I waved and he tilted his head. I wish I could do something. March 17th. I left some bread for the shepherd this morning. He sniffed it but didn't eat much. I think he's scared to take food when people are watching. Mr. Whitaker was in the driveway, and he looked at me in a way that made my stomach twist. I've heard people say he can be mean. Noah turned the page carefully. The ink was slightly smudged, where Lily must have brushed her hand across fresh words. March 20th. This morning the shepherd came closer to the fence when he saw me. I crouched down and scratched the dirt just under the wire. He pushed his nose through and licked my fingers. His ears are so soft. He's not wild, he's gentle. But when I was petting him, Trent came out. He shouted at me to get away, said the dog was dangerous and I was trespassing. The way he pulled on the leash made the shepherd yelp. I can't stop thinking about that sound. The pages rustled as Noah's grip tightened. He could picture it, Lily, kneeling in the frost-damp grass, the shepherd leaning toward her, and then Trent's shadow falling across them like a closing door. He kept reading. March 22nd. I told Mom I was worried about the shepherd. She said I should stay away, that the Whitakers aren't people you want to make angry. But I can't just leave him there. He looked worse today. His water bowl was tipped over and he didn't have any shelter from the wind. I gave him half my lunch. Trent saw me again. He got really close to me this time, too close. He said, "You think you're helping? You'll regret it." Noah swallowed hard. The handwriting grew shakier on the last entry he found. March 25th. I don't know why I'm writing this down, except that I can't tell anyone. I saw Trent drive away really fast tonight. The shepherd was barking loud, urgent. I think something's wrong. If I can, I'll check on him tomorrow. I hope he's okay. That was the last page. Noah sat there for a long time, the dust motes swirling in the gold light around him. The date on the final entry was the same day Lily had died. When he finally came down from the attic, his face was pale and set. Helen and Alice were in the kitchen, Shadow lying at their feet. The dog lifted his head when Noah entered, his eyes locking onto him, as if sensing what he carried. I found this, Noah said, placing the blue notebook gently on the table. Helen reached for it, her hands trembling slightly as she opened to the first page. She read in silence, her lips moving faintly over the words, until she reached the part where Lily described petting Shadow. She stopped, her gaze distant. This was the day I saw her last, Helen murmured. She told me she had somewhere to be, but she smiled in that way she did when she thought she was doing something important. Alice took the notebook next, her brow furrowing deeper with every line. When she reached the last entry, she closed her eyes. She knew, Alice whispered. She knew something was wrong. And she went anyway. Reverend Paul had been standing quietly in the doorway, listening. This means, he said slowly, that Trent wasn't just careless. He had reason to silence her. And to get rid of Shadow, Noah added. Because Shadow saw it. He was there. Helen looked down at Shadow, who had risen and come to stand beside her chair. She reached to rest her hand on his head. All this time, she said softly, we thought you were just lost. But you've been carrying this for us, haven't you? Shadow's gaze was steady, unblinking, as if to say, there was more yet to tell. Noah straightened. This changes everything. It's not just about keeping him safe anymore. It's about telling the truth. About Lily. Outside, the light was fading into a winter twilight, the sky deepening to indigo. But in the kitchen, a different kind of clarity had settled, cold, hard, and bright as frost. They had a story now, one written in Lily's own hand, a story that threaded directly from her kindness to the moment her life ended. And in the center of that story, like the still point of a turning wheel, was the German shepherd who had survived it all. The question now was how to make the rest of the town believe it. Somewhere in the darkening streets, the Whitakers would soon hear whispers that Lily Carter's words had surfaced again. And when they did, Shadow's quiet defiance would no longer be just a matter of choice. It would be a challenge to everything they had tried to bury. The morning broke in a pale wash of silver, the kind of winter light that seemed to soften edges and muffle sound. Frost clung stubbornly to the blades of grass outside Helen's house, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke drifting from chimneys across town. Noah stood on the porch with his hands deep in his coat pockets, glancing toward the driveway where Alice was helping Helen into the passenger seat of her car. Shadow waited beside them, his breath forming soft clouds in the cold air, his dark eyes watching the movement of each person as if reading the day's intent in their smallest gestures. No one said it out loud, but they all understood where they were going. The choice had been made the night before, after Lily's diary pages had been read, and the truth had settled in their bones like a shared weight. Helen had been the one to suggest it quietly, her voice trembling but sure we should take him to her. They drove in silence through streets still wet from the thaw of morning frost. Bare branches clawed gently at the pale sky, and the rhythmic hum of the tires seemed to underscore each unspoken thought. Helen sat with her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her fingers tightening now and then on the leather strap of her handbag. Noah drove, his jaw-set eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where Shadow sat upright, calm yet alert, the tip of his tail twitching against the seat. Alice leaned slightly toward the dog, her hand resting on the space beside him. "It's just a little further," she murmured, more for herself than for him. The cemetery lay on the edge of town, behind a low stone wall mottled with moss. When they turned onto the narrow gravel path, the crunch beneath the tires seemed suddenly too loud, like a disturbance in a place meant for quiet breathing. Helen's eyes found Lily's plot almost instantly. It was not grand, just a simple upright headstone of smooth gray granite set among a line of others beneath a small copse of birch trees. The ground here was scattered with last autumn's leaves, crisp and curling in shades of gold and brown. Someone had left fresh flowers in a small vase, delicate white lilies, their petals just beginning to curl at the tips. The car rolled to a stop. For a moment, no one moved. Then Helen opened her door, the cold rushing in sharp enough to bring tears to her eyes. She stepped out slowly, her boots pressing into the soft ground, and turned toward the back seat. Shadow's ears pricked forward when Noah opened the door. He didn't leap down as he often did. Instead, he stepped out with measured movements, his nose lifting to take in the mingled scents of grass stone and something quieter, something that seemed to settle over him like recognition. They walked together toward the grave. The sky was a soft gray dome overhead, the kind that made every sound feel close and hushed. Helen's breath trembled in front of her as she stopped a few feet away. But Shadow didn't pause. He stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Lily's headstone, his body aligned with its base. For a heartbeat, he just stood there, ears high, gaze fixed. Then slowly he lowered himself down, his front legs folding neatly under him until his chest touched the earth. He exhaled once, a low, almost inaudible sound, and laid one paw gently against the cold granite. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. Noah felt the moment like a physical blow. In that small, deliberate gesture, there was something more powerful than words, something that said, "I was there. I remember, and now I can rest." Shadow closed his eyes. A faint whine slipped from his throat, so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind through the birch branches, but it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a dog, allowing himself for the first time to grieve. Alice crouched down beside him, her knees pressing into the damp earth. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're safe now." Helen stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Shadow's bowed head. She reached out and brushed her fingers lightly over his fur, feeling the subtle tremor running beneath his skin. "You loved her?" she said, her voice a thin thread. "You were trying to protect her. I see that now." Noah stood a step back, watching the three of them, his grandmother, his aunt, and the dog, who had somehow become the bridge between them. He felt something shift in his chest, a release he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The minutes stretched, marked only by the occasional flutter of leaves and the faint creak of tree branches overhead. Then, as if some unseen signal had passed between them, Shadow opened his eyes and lifted his head. His gaze moved from the headstone to Helen, then to Noah, and finally to Alice. And then his tail moved once, twice, a slow, deliberate wag that seemed less about joy and more about acknowledgement. Noah felt the heat prick at the corners of his eyes. That wag wasn't casual. It was a signal the kind Officer Ward had once described when speaking about working dogs, a way of saying mission complete. Helen lowered herself to her knees beside him, heedless of the cold ground, and wrapped her arms gently around his neck. "Thank you," she murmured, her cheek against his fur. "For staying with her. For not leaving her alone." They stayed like that, the four of them, in a loose circle around Lily's resting place, until the cold began to seep through their coats and into their bones. But the air between them felt different now, less heavy, threaded with something warmer. As they turned back toward the path, Helen reached for Noah's hand. He took it without hesitation, and Alice fell into step beside them. Shadow walked at Helen's other side, close enough that his shoulder brushed her leg with each stride. They didn't speak on the way back to the car. The silence was not the silence of grief anymore, but of something shared and understood. When they reached the gate, Helen glanced back once more at the line of birch trees and the single gray stone beneath them. The wind had picked up slightly, stirring the white lilies in their vase. Shadow paused, too, looking over his shoulder. His ears twitched, his gaze lingering just long enough for Helen to feel certain that he wasn't leaving something behind, but carrying it with him. As Noah started the car, the first flakes of a light snow began to fall, slow, unhurried, each one catching in Shadow's fur like tiny points of light. Helen watched them melt against his coat, her fingers resting gently on his back. It struck her then that grief, like snow, did not always arrive in storms. Sometimes it came in these quiet drifts, settling softly until the landscape was changed. And in that pale drifting light, she understood that they were no longer just three people bound by loss. They were four bound now by the choice to face it together. Yet even as they drove away, a thought lingered in Noah's mind, sharp against the softness of the moment. If Shadow had marked this place as the end of one mission, it meant another might already be beginning. 3 months later, winter had surrendered to the first soft breath of spring, and the Victorian house on Willow Street was no longer the silent, hollow place it had once been. Where shadows had lingered in the corners, now sunlight pooled across polished wooden floors, warming the rugs and the wide bay windows. The scent of baking bread drifted from the kitchen, laughter spilled down the hallway, and the sound of nails clicking lightly against the floorboards often heralded the arrival of the most beloved resident, Shadow. He had changed, though, not in the way that erased his past. It was still there in the way his ears would sometimes swivel toward a faint sound outside, or how his body would tense momentarily before recognizing a friend. But there was a softness now in his eyes, a willingness to let the present take root. His ribs no longer pressed sharply against his skin, his coat gleamed under the sunlight, and he carried himself with the calm assurance of a dog who knew he had found his place. The Victorian house had changed too, not in its bones, but in its heart. Helen had filled it with signs of life, fresh flowers in jars, photographs of family layered on the mantel shelves, filled with books and small wooden carvings that Noah had made during quiet evenings. The largest transformation stood just beyond the front parlor. An airy room painted in soft cream where a hand-painted sign above the door read, "The Lily Carter Foundation." The foundation had grown faster than any of them expected. What began as a single idea, Helen's whispered wish to honor Lily, had become a fully functioning rescue network. Every month, dozens of animals were pulled from abandonment or neglect, given food, medical care, and a chance to heal. Volunteers came and went through the big front door, carrying crates, blankets, and stories of the lives they were helping to change. Helen found herself busier than she had been in years. Mornings were spent coordinating rescue runs with other shelters. Afternoons often meant driving to meet a frightened dog or an injured cat, and evenings were filled with paperwork and phone calls. Yet she never felt the weight as a burden. It was as though Lily's absence had left a space in her that could only be filled by giving others a home. Alice, too, had chosen to stay. She had been offered a prestigious position at a veterinary research facility in Chicago, but she declined. Fern Hollow had called her back not just because of her mother or Shadow, but because she had rediscovered a part of herself she thought she'd lost. The clinic she reopened in town quickly became a partner to the foundation, its waiting room always filled with a mix of rescued animals and local pets whose owners trusted Alice's gentle skill. Noah visited from Minneapolis, often more than anyone expected. He had found part-time work with a wildlife rehabilitation center, but each month he returned to Fern Hollow to help with the rescue operations. Sometimes he would stay a weekend, sometimes a full week, sleeping in the upstairs guest room that was slowly becoming his room again. And Shadow. Shadow had found a new purpose entirely. It began one afternoon when a volunteer suggested bringing him to a local care home for war veterans. The staff there had been hesitant, concerned about introducing a dog with a police background into such a delicate environment. But the moment Shadow entered the sunlit common room, the doubts faded. He moved with a quiet grace, approaching each resident, slowly allowing them to extend a hand first. His deep, steady gaze seemed to meet people somewhere far beyond words. One man, a retired officer with clouded eyes and trembling hands, had reached out and rested his palm against Shadow's head. "Steady, boy," he had whispered. The man's breathing slowed. His shoulders eased. For the first time in weeks, the nurses said he slept through the night. From there, Shadow became a regular presence not only at the care home, but also at the Children's Hospital, the local library reading program, and community support groups. People didn't just see a dog, they saw a survivor, a living story of resilience and trust rebuilt. It wasn't uncommon now for Helen to find him lying quietly beside a child, curled up with a book, or sitting patiently, while an elderly woman stroked his ears in silence. His canine training still lived in his precision and his awareness, but it had softened into something broader, something deeply human. An ability to be there, in the way most people never learned. The house became a gathering place. On weekends, the dining room table overflowed with plates of food, mugs of tea, and conversations that wove between rescue plans, family updates, and shared memories of Lily. The foundation's volunteers felt more like extended relatives, and the animals in temporary foster care often roamed freely through the house, adding their own rhythms to the life within those walls. On a breezy Saturday morning in late spring, Helen stood on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the front yard come alive. The rose bushes were beginning to bud again, their leaves glossy and green. A young terrier mix, rescued just a week before, chased a bright red ball across the lawn, while Shadow trotted alongside, letting the smaller dog lead the game. Alice stepped out beside her, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Hard to believe this is the same place," she said softly. Helen smiled, her eyes following Shadow. "It's not the same," she replied. "It's what it was always meant to be." From somewhere inside, laughter erupted. Noah's voice mingled with another volunteer's, followed by the unmistakable clatter of a dropped pan. Helen didn't even flinch. She knew the house could absorb any chaos, now the kind that came from life being fully lived. Later that afternoon, they all gathered in the parlor for a small ceremony. Helen had received a letter confirming that the foundation's funding would be renewed for another year, thanks to donations and grants inspired by Shadow's work as a therapy dog. They had decided to mark the occasion with a new framed photograph above the mantel. Shadow lying beside a child in the hospital, his head resting gently on the bed, his eyes calm and steady. As they hung the frame, Helen felt a swell of emotion that rose from somewhere deep, somewhere both joyful and aching. She thought of Lily, not only of the day they lost her, but of the way she had moved through the world, open-hearted, unable to turn away from a creature in need. Shadow, sitting nearby, lifted his head at the sound of her voice as she said softly, "You've brought her back to us in ways we couldn't have imagined." The dog blinked slowly, his tail giving a faint, steady thump against the floor. When evening settled in, the Victorian house glowed from within. Lamps lit every room, casting warm halos onto walls lined with photographs of rescues and the people who had helped them. Outside, the air was cool and fragrant, with the first blooms of the season. Helen stood at the doorway for a moment, looking back at her family. The daughter who had returned, the grandson who had reconnected the dog, who had carried them through grief into something larger than themselves. It was then she understood healing was not a single moment, but a series of small choices, each one pulling them further from the darkness toward the light. In the kitchen, Noah's laughter rang out again. Alice was leaning over Shadow, adjusting the bright blue therapy vest he would wear for tomorrow's visit to the hospital. The dog stood patiently, ears slightly tilted toward her voice, his steady posture a quiet promise that he would go wherever they asked, bringing with him the silent message that survival was possible. Helen closed the door against the evening chill, and the house seemed to hold its own heartbeat, steady, sure and full. Somewhere inside her, she knew this was only the beginning. There would be more animals to rescue, more people to reach, more stories to witness. But now they would face it together. And as Shadow settled at her feet, his gaze warm and unguarded, Helen thought of the simplest truth they had all come to learn. Sometimes the light you need is carried to you on 4 paws, wearing a history you can't undo, but shining all the brighter for having walked through the dark.